New Glenn suffers a dramatic explosion on the pad while preparing for its return to flight. So how will this affect NASA's moon base plans? NASA buys more Crew Dragon missions. Does this mean that Starliner is done for? And Virgin Galactic is flying VSS Unity again? As always, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. This week, NASA gave an update on its plans for the upcoming moon base, and there's quite a lot to unpack. But the explosion of Blue Origin's New Glenn on the pad may alter the future of these plans. Let's start with the first update, which relates to 3 upcoming missions under the agency's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, also known as CLPS. These missions consist of Blue Origin's first Blue Moon Mark I lander, Astrobotic's first Griffin lander, and Intuitive Machines' third Nova C lander. All 3 have now been renamed as Moonbase 1, Moonbase 2, and Moonbase 3, respectively. These missions are not new, but their renaming puts emphasis on their role as part of new efforts towards the Lunar Outpost. During the Moonbase 1 mission, the Blue Moon Mark I lander, called Endurance, will be landing on the Shackleton Connecting Ridge on the lunar South Pole, testing the navigation, propulsion, and guidance systems that will eventually be used on Blue's Mark II lander, with humans on board. The mission will fly a couple of NASA payloads, one that will study the interaction between the engine plume of the lander and the lunar dust, and a laser retroreflective array which will help spacecraft in orbit use it as a sort of navigation beacon. Astrobotic's Griffin lander will also be landing on the lunar South Pole and will be carrying several payloads, not only from government agencies like NASA and the European Space Agency, but also from commercial partners like Astrolab's Flip rover, which, as we'll discuss later, is quite a big deal to NASA's future lunar missions. Intuitive Machines' third Nova C lander, called Trinity, will not be going to the lunar South Pole, but will instead be studying a mysterious region of the moon called the Reiner Gamma Swirl. It's believed that lunar swirls like this form on areas of the moon where the local magnetic field is strong, shielding the surface from high radiation from the sun. Trinity will be carrying payloads from NASA to study this phenomenon, including a small rover from commercial company Lunar Outpost, remember that name for later, that will be deployed from the lander with even more payloads on board to study the magnetic fields in the area. The European Space Agency and the Korean Astronomy and Space Science Institute are also carrying payloads on board Trinity. At least 2 of the moon-based missions are expected to take place before the end of the year, but as always, schedules can change. I mean, once again, New Glenn explosion, right? Now don't worry, I will get to that in just a minute. These 3 missions are just the first 3 in a long list of missions, and NASA says even more will be announced later this year. But something we know for sure is that the future lunar base will have rovers. In fact, NASA plans to have lots of them, and they'll evolve in design as the base is being built. Thus, the first phase of the lunar base, which runs from now until 2029, will feature the first phase of the Lunar Terrain Vehicles, also known as LTVs. These LTVs are unpressurized rovers, much like the old Apollo ones, but built with modern technology, and are meant to have way more capability than those Apollo rovers. For this early phase, the LTVs will be simplified versions of the ones that NASA originally asked for a few years ago, as the agency recently decided to accelerate their development by either removing certain requirements that were very complex to meet, or simplifying some requirements to something that would be much more manageable. But these are still quite capable rovers, needing to be able to traverse hundreds of kilometers, both in crewed and uncrewed mode, across their several uses, to survive up to 150 hours in shadow, to operate at speeds of up to 10 kilometers per hour, and to be able to traverse slopes of up to 20 degrees. It was during this week's update that NASA announced who would be building the first phase of LTVs, and the companies may sound familiar because we mentioned them earlier: Astrolab and Lunar Outpost. Astrolab will be carrying its crewed lunar vehicle, which is a simplified version of its larger Flex rover. As mentioned earlier, the company is preparing to launch another rover called Flip, which stands for Flex Lunar Innovation Platform, and which will be testing the same tires, batteries, and wheel actuators that were part of the Flex rover design, and that will now be part of the crewed lunar vehicle rover as well. Meanwhile, Lunar Outpost will be delivering its Pegasus rover, an evolution of the company's Eagle rover that was already in development. The company also built a smaller uncrewed rover called MAP that flew on the second flight of the Intuitive Machines Nova C lander, but unfortunately did not get to do too much because the lander ended up sideways. They do intend to fly another one later this year as part of the third Nova C mission, which we discussed earlier in the story. Now, the big missing name for these LTV awards is Intuitive Machines, which was the third in the list of companies selected back in 2024 as contenders. It's worth mentioning, though, that these are just the initial rovers, and in the second phase of the moon base buildup, NASA will start making use of the pressurized rover being delivered by the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, also known as JAXA. That one will provide not only mobility, but also early surface habitation for the initial crews until permanent habitats are in place. Now, in order to deliver the LTV rovers, someone has to get them to the lunar surface, and as part of this week's update, NASA also announced that it had selected Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark 1 lander for that task. It kind of makes sense for them to award this to them, as it's a lander in the performance class needed to deliver these roughly 1-ton rovers to the lunar surface. It's also already under contract to deliver NASA's own Viper rover, so by the time Blue Origin delivers those rovers, they'll have some past experience. The only other landers currently in development that are part of NASA's CLPS program and are on this payload mass range would be Astrobotic's Griffin lander and Intuitive Machines' Supernova lander, a much bigger sibling of the Nova C lander. Now, originally I was going to say that this added pressure on Blue to deliver on its landers because they were preparing a Mark 1 lander to fly later this year, and then a second Mark 1 lander to fly next year as well, carrying NASA's Viper rover, and then they also had to fabricate whatever lander they planned to use for the Artemis III rendezvous and joint operations test flight. Not only that, but they also have the uncrewed demonstration landing with their own human landing system lander, whatever that design is, since it's not clear if it'll either be Mark 1 or Mark 2 landers, or maybe a mix of both. That uncrewed lunar landing may require multiple vehicles that would be used as tugs for the main lander, and then of course they have to repeat all of this for the crewed landing as well. Plus, now they've got 2 more landers to deliver the rovers that were selected by NASA. Yeah, I was going to say all of that added some pressure on Blue, but now on top of all of that, New Glenn just exploded on the pad right as we were writing this episode. Talk about some breaking news, huh? The explosion occurred right as the company was preparing for the return to flight of the rocket. You might recall it had a mishap during the previous launch with the Bluebird 7 satellite on board back in April. Blue Origin had integrated the rocket in the days prior and rolled it out to the pad, without payload, for a routine pre-launch test at Launch Complex 36. We observed propellant loading and had our own Jerry Pike observing south of Jetty Park, which is located on the other side of the Port Canaveral Channel from the pad. There was an earlier abort in the countdown, noticeable because of the activation of the water deluge system, but no actual ignition of the tanks. At 9 p.m. Eastern, the deluge system activated again, and the engines ignited. Within seconds, smoke came out of the base of the rocket, and its 2 stages exploded in a giant deflagration that also damaged the nearby infrastructure. The transporter erector was visibly gone. The massive lightning protection tower next to the rocket was also gone, and there were visible fires near the base of the pad that were not supposed to be there. We're not sure at this point if any other hardware was damaged either. Blue Origin was actually preparing for a tank farm expansion to introduce propellant subcooling for New Glenn, and was even starting to break ground for a new launch pad to the north for future New Glenn versions, like New Glenn 9x4. Inside that hangar, Blue had its first flight-proven New Glenn booster called Never Tell Me the Odds, which was undergoing refurbishment. There were also New Glenn second stages, and there might have been other tooling and critical equipment. But the important thing from this explosion is that luckily no one was injured. Blue Origin posted on X confirmation of the anomaly during the test, and that all personnel had been accounted for. This is always important. Hardware can be replaced, of course, but people can't. So despite the setback, it's good to know that everyone is safe. Blue Origin's owner, Jeff Bezos, also went on social media saying, quote, "Very rough day, but we'll rebuild whatever needs rebuilding and get back to flying." Other officials from the industry also spoke publicly about the issue, including Elon Musk, CEO of SpaceX, who's no stranger to rocket explosions himself. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman also went on X to express his thoughts in reaction to this incident. Relevant for this news segment is his note saying, quote, "We will work with our partners to support a thorough investigation of this anomaly, assess near-term mission impacts, and get back to launching rockets." It's certainly a tough day for Blue Origin, and it may take some time for them to figure out what happened and how to solve this. So, with all that taken into account, let's go back to the moon base news because, well, that wasn't actually the end of everything that NASA announced in that event. They also announced the selection of Firefly Aerospace and their Elytra spacecraft to deliver the MoonFall drones that are being developed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. These drones are small lunar hoppers that can not only fly over rough terrain and other dangerous areas of the moon, but are also small enough that they can be used to reach areas that rovers can't reach. These drones will be carrying several cameras that will image the terrain in high resolution, serving as scouts. They can also be used to mark the perimeter of the lunar base and carry other scientific payloads before any humans arrive at the landing site. Firefly's Elytra spacecraft will deliver these drones to the moon by deploying them in a suborbital trajectory, allowing them to complete the landing on their own. Sort of how the SR-1 Freedom spacecraft is expected to drop off the Skyfall helicopter entry capsule on its way to Mars, but not literally deliver them to the surface. This mission is currently planned for no earlier than 2028, so we're not too far away from seeing this happen. On top of all of this, just after the conference announcing all of these lunar base updates, NASA also issued a press release stating that the agency plans to announce the crew of Artemis III on June 9th. So a little over a week from now, we should know the names of the astronauts who will be flying on board Orion to meet and test the landers that will, hopefully, return humans back to the lunar surface. These are quite the times that we live in. If you want to follow along for even more coverage of these exciting times, tune into future episodes of This Week in Spaceflight and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss them. The James Webb Space Telescope has just provided some new insights into one of its most tantalizing early discoveries: mysterious red objects that only existed in the early days of the universe. The telescope's sensitivity allows it to look at objects so distant that their light has taken billions of years, or most of the universe's existence, to traverse space before hitting Webb's sensors. So essentially, the observatory is looking back in time at the early universe. Of course, we can't see what these parts of space look like today, because we'd have to wait billions of years to see that. Soon after Webb started peering out at the early universe, astronomers found that it's peppered with little red dots, and they're still trying to figure out just what these objects are. This week, a couple of studies were published to try to answer this question by focusing on a particular red dot called Abell 2744 QS01. Rolls right off the tongue, right? Astronomers call it QS01 for short. Its light has been traveling for 13 billion years, meaning that it was around just 700 million years after the Big Bang. In human terms, there's nothing little about this little dot, though. It's actually 1,300 light years across, but that's only a couple percent of the size of the Milky Way, so it's actually really small on an astronomical scale. What makes this dot a particularly interesting target for astronomers, though, is that it is gravitationally lensed. Now, what does that mean? Well, it has to do with light following a curved path through space. Massive objects bend space-time, which is sometimes also described as the fabric of the universe. We know this from Einstein's general relativity. This phenomenon causes the pull towards massive objects, which we all know as gravity, but the bent space-time also affects light, which doesn't necessarily follow a straight path through space, but instead follows the curves of the warped space-time near massive objects. This effect means that these objects act like a lens, creating all kinds of interesting optical effects for our telescopes to spot in the sky, like visually distorting entire galaxies into Einstein rings. The actual galaxies themselves have a regular shape, but we just see them as rings because of the distortions that happen before their light hits our telescopes. But in the case of our little red dot, the galaxy cluster called Abell 2744, or Pandora's cluster, projects 3 images of our dot in different locations of the sky. And it's magnified too. So as you might imagine, that makes studying it a whole lot easier. I'm sure the astronomers don't mind the universe helping them out a little bit too. The good view of QS01 helped the scientists behind the recent studies to investigate how the material in the little red dot rotates around its center. Earlier studies of the object found evidence for a black hole at its center, and the speed at which the surrounding material rotates allowed the researchers to calculate the black hole's mass. They found that it's 50 million times the mass of our sun, or a stunning 2/3 of the red dot's mass. But where does such a large object in the early universe even come from? There hadn't been much time for material to accumulate into a black hole. The scientists believe that it must have formed before the galaxy surrounding it, so they proposed two options. It could either have been a cloud of material directly collapsing into a black hole, or a so-called primordial black hole, which formed within the first seconds after the Big Bang. Both of these types of black holes have been theorized for a while, but no conclusive evidence has been found for either. But evidence is coming in with studies like these, especially when they hold up to scientific scrutiny over time. And slowly, all of these scraps of evidence build up until they paint an undeniable picture. Astronomers will have to keep studying QS01 and little red dots like it for that picture to fully crystallize, but we already understand these dots much better than when Webb first laid eyes on them a few years ago. Give it a few more years, and we may have all but unraveled the mystery. One of the scientists working on the recent studies has already called the new discoveries a paradigm shift, and that may just prove to be true. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with SpaceX's Crew Dragon, which recently had an additional 6 NASA missions added to its manifest. Last week, NASA issued a notice of intent indicating that the agency intended to modify SpaceX's commercial crew contract to add 6 additional missions. According to the notice, the reason for NASA to award these missions to SpaceX is because Boeing's Starliner is not yet certified, and the agency needs to prepare for more crew missions to the International Space Station. SpaceX is currently under contract only up to Crew 14. Crew 12 has already launched, and Crew 13 is set to launch in September, so the last mission under contract could be less than a year away. Thus, with this award, NASA prepares for further missions beyond Crew 14. This doesn't look great for Starliner's future, as these additional 6 missions would, in theory, cover all of NASA's needs for crew transport through the end of the ISS program, provided that they stick with the 2030 deorbit timeline. Essentially, NASA would no longer need Starliner for crewed flights to the station. So does this mean that Starliner is doomed? Well, there is a technicality here that may still save Starliner. The way that this contract modification works is that technically, NASA is only officially ordering an extra 3 missions beyond Crew 14 and just placing options for another 3 more beyond those. So one way for Starliner to still be in the game would be for Boeing to solve all of its issues on time, launch an uncrewed Starliner 1 mission next year, certify the spacecraft for crew, and then do 2 or 3 rotation missions for the remaining years of the station before its deorbit. SpaceX would complement those rotation missions with the 3 missions that NASA has committed to pay for already. But if that doesn't happen, NASA can then choose to proceed with the other 3 missions on Dragon as part of the contract extension and fly those instead of Starliner. So, will Boeing be able to fly crew to the ISS again? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Space tourism company Virgin Galactic dusted off its VSS Unity spacecraft and sent it back into the air after nearly 2 years of retirement. Until June of 2024, VSS Unity flew humans up to the edge of space 12 times, including 7 commercial spaceflights. Now, whether surpassing 80 kilometers or 50 miles actually counts as going to space is a debate for you all for another time. But then the company suddenly grounded Unity to focus on its next generation of spaceships, designed to fly over 500 missions at a cadence of 2 every week. As we recently saw, the first of these new ships is coming along well, although nowhere near ready for flight yet. Nevertheless, Virgin hopes that it can start glide flights in the 3rd quarter of this year and commence commercial space flights in the following quarter. After no flights for nearly 2 years, the company is now trying to get its pilots ready for flying regular missions. Of course, they have a simulator, which we got a close look at in 2024, but an actual aircraft, or spacecraft I guess, will always give a more realistic experience. And that's why Unity is back in the air. The old spaceship is very similar to its successor, so it should help the pilots get accustomed to what they may encounter during flights with the new vehicle, but Unity won't go to space again. It's not fitted with an engine for those flights, so its only option after the release call is to glide back down, like the glide flights that the new ship will start its career with. Later in the week, Virgin Galactic also announced plans for one of the spaceflights with the new ship. Sometime next year, nonprofit organization Operation Period will start a mission to study menstruation. Although over 100 women have now flown into space, menstruation has never been directly studied in microgravity. As far as we're aware, no astronauts have experienced any complications with it, but having actual scientific data would help to make space more accessible for half of the population. And this mission is just the start of that. even if it's just for a few minutes. Before this mission can fly, though, Virgin Galactic needs to get its spaceships back to space. They're working hard to get to that point before the end of the year, but as always, we'll believe it when we see it. 4 Russian satellites have recently made some interesting moves in space. They were launched in April atop a Soyuz 2.1B from Plesetsk as part of a group of 6 satellites. In the last few weeks, the 4 have burned a lot of fuel to change their orbital planes, according to a report by Integrity ISR. What's strange is that the new orbits are nearly coplanar with another satellite, so much so that it's most likely intentional. Governments spy on each other's satellites all the time, but now Russia is targeting a commercial spacecraft. The other satellite is a synthetic aperture radar satellite from the Finland-based company ICEYE's Earth observation constellation. The small satellite, known as ICEYE X-36, was launched alongside 2 more ICEYE satellites on board SpaceX's Transporter 10 mission in March of 2024. So what are these Russian satellites up to? And why? Well, that brings us squarely into speculation theory, so we're gonna keep it short. What we do know is that Ukraine uses ICEYE's data for military purposes, so that might have to do with the why. Whether Russia's just getting close to spy on some spy satellites or to do some actual damage, we don't know. They could just be threatening them, all bark and no bite. We'll have to wait and see, and hopefully it won't get too messy. Please. Varda Space Industries announced its W4 mission has ended this week after orbiting our planet for nearly a year, but something was hidden between the lines of the announcement. It didn't quite go to plan. Last year, on June 23rd, the W4 capsule launched aboard SpaceX's Transporter 14 mission. This was the first time that the capsule was mounted onto Varda's own satellite bus instead of the Photon satellite bought from Rocket Lab. The company's W series of capsules is built and designed as an orbital factory to produce materials that can only be manufactured in the microgravity environment of space. Think things like pharmaceuticals or specialized fiber optic cables. To that end, the capsule is also designed to re-enter so that whatever it produced in space can then be recovered. That was also the plan for W4, which even featured the first heat shield entirely built by Varda. It stayed up for much longer than the mission before it, which only lasted a few weeks, but now the mission has finally come to an end, and not with the capsule recovery like originally planned, but after performing a disposal burn. Clearly, something went wrong, although Varda didn't announce what happened. They did say, though, that what they learned during W4 fed into the W5 and W6 missions, which have both since been successful, with the latter returning just a couple of weeks ago. So we do hope that Varda can keep that success streak going. China's next reusable launcher was spotted vertical on the launch pad this week. The Changzheng 12B is set to launch its maiden flight in June. It's the last of 3 Changzheng 12 variants to debut. The plain, medium-lift Changzheng 12 has been flying for a few years now and has already completed 5 successful missions. The 2-stage rocket is powered by liquid oxygen and rocket-grade kerosene, or RP1, in a configuration that is not reusable. Then there's the 12A variant, which swapped out its propellant chemistry for liquid methane and oxygen. It's less powerful than the plain Changzheng 12, but it has a reusable first stage. So far, it's only flown once, in December, successfully making it to orbit, but failing on the booster recovery part. And now finally, there's the Changzheng 12B, which was spotted this week. This variant uses the original RP1 plus liquid oxygen propellant combo, but adds reusability. It's also supposed to be more powerful than the original, making it comparable to Falcon 9. Like Falcon 9, its booster will be reusable as well, and the one spotted at Zhochuan this week has the required landing legs installed, although we've seen reports that it might not try for a landing on its first flight. That mission is set to lift off sometime in June, so keep your eyes on our space traffic reports to know when it happens. And speaking of which, this is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. This week in launches kicked off with the launch of the Shenzhou 23 crew mission to the Tiangong space station. The mission was carrying Chinese astronauts Zhu Yongzhu, Zhang Jiyuan, and Lai Ka-ying. This is Yongzhu's second flight to space and the first for Jiyuan and Ka-ying. Ka-ying is also the first Hong Kong native to fly into space. With the arrival of the Shenzhou 23 crew, now the crew of Shenzhou 21 can return to Earth. And no, I didn't get my numbers wrong. The reason that there's no Shenzhou 22 crew is because the Shenzhou 22 spacecraft had to be sent to the Tiangong space station as a lifeboat for the crew of Shenzhou 21. And the reason for that was because when the crew of Shenzhou 20 was set to return home, they found a crack in the descent capsule window. The Shenzhou 20 crew then returned on the Shenzhou 21 spacecraft, and Shenzhou 20 returned to Earth uncrewed. Remember all that? This game of space musical chairs leads us to today, where the Shenzhou 21 crew, now relieved from their duties on the station by the Shenzhou 23 crew, has returned to Earth on the Shenzhou 22 spacecraft. Thankfully, from here on out, it'll be much easier to follow along. Or so I hope. Apart from the Shenzhou 23 launch, we also had another launch from China, carrying one of the secretive TJS satellites by the Chinese military into geosynchronous transfer orbit. Their name, TJS, comes from Tongxian Jishu Xian, which roughly translates into Test Communications Satellite. Like many of its counterparts, its purpose is unknown, but it's believed to be for signal intelligence gathering. From the United States, we also had a few Falcon 9 launches this week, carrying another 82 Starlink satellites into low Earth orbit. If all goes well, we should also have had the 7th operational launch of Amazon LEO satellites on board ULA's Atlas V rocket, but we'll cover the details in the next episode. Up on the International Space Station, we also had a spacewalk on the Russian side of the station. Performed by Sergei Kudzverchkov and Sergei Mikheyev, the EVA took about 6 hours, during which the cosmonauts collected and installed science experiments on the outside of the Russian modules Naoka and Zvezda. They also photographed one of the core's rendezvous antennas on the Progress MS-33 spacecraft that did not deploy after the spacecraft's orbital insertion. This stuck rendezvous antenna had forced the crew to manually dock Progress a few weeks back, but now they were actually able to look at the mechanism and image it for engineers on the ground to study why it didn't deploy. The crew also secured the antenna with tie-downs to keep it from accidentally deploying, either during docked operations or after undocking. A previous spacecraft, Progress M19M, suffered the same issue back in 2013, and its rendezvous antenna unexpectedly deployed after undocking, causing concern that it could have damaged the docking port where it had been located. While it did not cause any damage at the time, Roscosmos isn't playing with fire this time around and preferred the antenna to be firmly secured, just in case. Going into next week, we'll have more Starlinks on the schedule, with up to 3 potentially taking place before our next episode. China will also be busy with 3 different launches on the calendar across 3 different spaceports. The South Korean military may also be trying to carry out the first flight of a full version of its own small satellite launch vehicle that's been under development for a few years now. A version of it flew in 2023 with an inert second stage and deployed a small satellite into orbit. This flight is slated to carry all fully active stages for an all-up test of the system. Now, the reason why I said maybe trying before is because it's not been formally announced yet, so we're speculating based on the different hazard notices that are out for this launch. As always, we recommend that you go to nextspaceflight.com or download the Next Spaceflight app on your phone to always keep an eye on the launch schedule, as well as other spaceflight events. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.